I really don't know where to start this one. Today we're talking about Deltarune Chapter 3 and 4's weird route changes. Since the last video, I've actually played it, and wow, there's a lot here. I'll leave my thoughts and review of all of this until the end, so I guess we'll just get into the changes. There is only one proper change in Chapter 3 as far as I know, and it's at this section when Ralsei asks Chris who they want to go to the festival with. You have the opportunity to select Noelle here, at which point Ralsei says he doesn't think this is a good idea. So I wonder if this implies that Ralsei knows what Chris did in Chapter 2. He doesn't say this dialogue or even hint towards Chris keeping away from Noelle in any other route. I suppose it's possible that Ralsei has some knowledge of the Snowgrave shenanigans in Chapter 2. It seems that he knows what the full prophecy is that we see throughout Chapter 4, and perhaps he's realised that some of the things that were supposed to happen in that prophecy haven't happened. For example, Queen's Chariot here. If you play the Snowgrave route, this section with Queen's Chariot does not happen. So maybe Ralsei can sort of sense that something's gone wrong. Maybe he doesn't know the full details of what we made Chris actually do, but perhaps he can sense that there's something going wrong, and perhaps it has something to do with Noelle. Last video I didn't talk too deeply about Ram's secret minigames in Chapter 3, and that's because I thought they were more applicable in this video actually. Ram's minigames seem to be a tutorial of sorts on how to actually do the Snowgrave route in Chapter 2. Not only are some of the areas in these minigames very reminiscent of Cyber City, to progress in these games, you have to defeat every single monster, then at one point acquire a mage who has ice powers, then with them freeze enemies to solve puzzles in order to progress, even at one point freezing a blue bird who looks very familiar in a strikingly familiar shaped crystal. So I think this is Toby's way as the developer of sort of giving us a tutorial on how to do the Snowgrave route. I suppose if that secret route hadn't been discovered by the time Chapter 3 was out, this was supposed to be the way that we found out about it. There is also this detail when Chris starts playing the game, where we see the soul in the middle of the screen, and we see the game transition from that soul to Chris's little sprite placed on top of it, which I think it could definitely imply that we are sort of possessing the mini Chris in some form in these moments, and that can be seen in how we can control the mini Chris outside of the game, independently from Chris. I don't know if the soul is literally going into the mini Chris in these moments, because it seems like we're still controlling Chris, so it might be more of a symbolic thing, but it's still an interesting little detail, I think. We also have moments of Chris actually fighting our control, like when we approach the bunker here. It's almost giving Chris a glimpse of what it's like to control a character in a game. Basically, it's letting Chris see from our perspective in some way. This section was re-recorded from the original video because I have no idea what was here. I had lost the audio, so I hope this was sort of close to what I originally said. At the end, there's then the fight against this guy, who the game calls Eram in the files, or Mare backwards. Perhaps this refers to a nightmare? The Dark Worlds have multiple times been equated to dreams, so I suppose the Snowgrave route would be a nightmare instead. This name isn't actually said in the game, so it could equally just be a reference to The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, which these minigames are very much styled after, wherein you fight a very similar boss to this guy, who is also called Nightmare. I much prefer to call him John Mantle though. Yeah, I think that's a much better name. It makes me wonder though if John Mantle represents anything in the Snowgrave route, as everything else in these secret minigames seems to be an allegory for it. Maybe it's some sort of secret boss that we'll find in the Snowgrave route that's only defeatable in the Snowgrave route. I think it would make sense that this guy represents something. Now we're going into Chapter 4 where the most changes are noted. The first real change is upon approaching Noelle in the church. Instead of being very willing to chat here, she asks Chris to talk with her later, and instead of getting the shelter information from her, we get it from Rudy in this timeline instead. Also, instead of Chris and Susie asking Noelle if they can hang out at hers, Noelle actually comes up to them and asks them, and this is probably so she can have Chris over to talk with. Then after this, Chris does not high-five Susie in this scene like they usually would, and Susie wonders if it's because they dislike Noelle. In reality, it's much more likely that they remember what we did to Noelle, and really don't want us to go round to her house and be near her in any way. They are probably scared for Noelle right now. Susie then straight up says that things have taken a weird route, pretty much canonizing that name instead of the Snowgrave route. I think this is quite a funny little line, but for all the wrong reasons, like in this quite horrific alternate pathway through the game. Kind of a bit of dark comedy there in a sense. At this point you can go and visit Birdley in the hospital, and it seems he's just about alive after being hit with Snowgrave previously. Talking to the receptionist reveals that it was Chris who brought Birdley in, which presumably happened when Chris jumped out of the window at the end of chapter 2. Apparently here he's breathing slowly, likely not in a good physical state at all right now. Also, he seems cold, showing that spells and effects in the dark world can have real, tangible, lasting effects on lighteners once they return to the light world. Interacting with Birdley, you have the choice to either heat him up or leave him. If you heat him up, the description of him changes to him feeling more relaxed. I can't imagine what Chris is thinking at this point. Like, we've put Birdley through this and then are attempting to help him. Chris must be confused and conflicted in these moments, man. Interacting with the radiator at all causes Chris to increase the temperature without any choice from the player. I reckon this is a small example of Chris taking any chance to defy us, or they're at least trying to make the best out of a bad situation here. We chose to interact with the heater, giving them the chance to do what they want with it. Once you get to the holiday house, there are no notable changes until you sit down at the couch. Instead of getting a call from Birdley since he's at the hospital, Noelle receives a call from her mother. It seems that she's checking in on Noelle. She seems very overprotective of Noelle, shown here from her telling Noelle not to burn herself, and in the end she eventually ends up coming home anyway, even after Noelle told her not to worry. That overprotectiveness could come from the fact that she's lost December before, so she wants to protect her remaining daughter as best as she can. Just like in the normal route, you can enter December's room at this point. Chris removes the soul, like normal. However, on the way out of the room, Chris is interrupted by Noelle, inviting them into her room. In this moment, they stash the soul in this drawer. Chris then puts the soul in the box as usual, but with a lot more force than in the normal route. They do use this amount of force in the normal route, but only the second time they put us in the box after we've already escaped. They are clearly a lot more distressed and fed up with the soul in this route. If we, as the soul, at this point enter Noelle's room, we can witness her and Chris's conversation. She reveals that she wants to chat about what happened last night. By that alone, we can ascertain that this has to have happened when Chris jumped out the window at the end of chapter 2. The screen then goes black. At this point, she explains how traumatized she was by the events of chapter 2 Snowgrave, and how she's terrified that it was all real. Apparently, in the middle of the night, she went out on the porch when she felt Chris's hand on her wrist. She then heard their voice. Chris apologized for being so weird yesterday. They told her that Birdley is going to be fine, and if you equipped Noelle's watch to Chris in chapter 2, they apologized for taking it. She then says they put the watch back on Noelle's wrist. She also says it feels like a long time since she's heard Chris's normal voice, even though they sounded so weak and shaky, which is likely because they had their soul taken out at this point in the game. I suppose the reason that Noelle hasn't heard Chris's normal voice in a while is because we've been taking over their body and changing their voice and manipulating their words. One slightly strange part of this is that even though Noelle said that Chris gave back the watch, they still have it in their inventory in chapter 3 and 4. So I guess Chris took it back from Noelle after putting it back on her wrist so that we won't get suspicious of them. So to us, nothing would look amiss in the menus, we wouldn't notice that anything happened. She then says, Chris, you're back, before the screen returns to being visible. I'm not entirely sure what this could mean. Perhaps this was Chris coming back to Noelle to take the watch back? She also then assumes it must have all been a prank. At this point, Noelle asks if she can say something else, at which point we get the option to select Proceed. Selecting this allows the soul to escape the vents and appear in the position in the room where they are in the text window. This is such a cool moment because we break the game here by using the text window to escape the vents. Such an interesting moment, showing that we as the soul are almost one layer above this whole universe and can break the laws of physics of what should be possible here. Now we can maneuver the soul back over to Chris and retake control of them. During this, Noelle explains that night, Chris also pulled a thorn out of Noelle's finger. This is what the thorn ring transformed into upon going back to the light world, a splinter. Then she explains that Chris told her to not say any of what she just said out loud. These two things are also perhaps what Chris said when they were back. Chris then, without our input, covers Noelle's mouth. She says that Chris told her that what she said would be heard. To Noelle, that doesn't really make any sense, because there's no one else in this room to hear them. Chris knows that we can hear everything they say. Again, all of this seems to be Chris trying to make the best out of a bad situation, trying to salvage their friendship with Noelle, and hoping this dark path everything has taken won't go any further. But when Noelle asks who will hear, we can respond, me. At which point, the colour in the room distorts, and a wind seems to blow from below Chris, from the rough point where their soul would be. Noelle comments that Chris's voice just sounded like the one from her dream. Our voice. The one that she could still hear, even if Chris was downed in battle. We can then say, because it wasn't a dream. She then says there's no way that Chris can hear her thoughts. We can then say, I heard. She says, it must have been a coincidence. Then we can say, it's not a coincidence. Noelle tests her theory by thinking. She asks us to say red or blue, then green or black. Then it didn't happen, or it didn't snow. At the end of all this, at the end of breaking Noelle even more through shattering her sense of reality, we then get the prompt, Noelle will get stronger, or Noelle becomes stronger. Then equip. At this point, Chris takes out the thorn ring. We can then select proceed. Noelle notices the thorn in their hand, and proceed. Noelle wonders why Chris is acting so differently to how they acted last night, and proceed. Noelle wonders why she can't move in this moment, and equip. Noelle holds out her hand to try and stop Chris, at which point Chris inserts the thorn into her finger. We have equipped the thorn ring to Noelle yet again. Noelle will get stronger. This animation is then shown over Noelle's position in the room, which I think represents us asserting yet more control over Noelle, almost like her soul has been shattered here. The next scene we witness is Chris in the bathroom. They are very angry. They throw the soul into the bin and proceed to kick it several times. At the end of this, Asgore interrupts, causing Chris to stop. He then reveals that Carol has asked everyone to leave. This is quite interesting, as Carol seems to have still come home early, even in this series of events. In this timeline, Chris seemingly didn't get the phone calls with the mysterious person that they did in the regular route in Chapter 4, so the person on the other end of the phone didn't know the situation this time, and didn't say the line, I'll be right there. This somewhat leads me to believe that it isn't Carol on the phone. Whether or not Chris was in contact with the phone person, Carol returns home anyway. Although I guess in this timeline of events, Noelle gets a call from Carol, so perhaps she comes comes home, but just for a different reason this time. Even after all this, Chris still reinserts the soul. If we check the menu at this point, we can see that Chris has lost 10 HP, which I think is the most amount of HP that Chris can lose in the light world. Seemingly that is because they have kicked us multiple times. They've hurt the soul, or maybe even hurt themselves from the kicking. Once outside, Asgore gives Chris a hot chocolate. Susie then reveals that she snooped around the house when Chris and Noelle were in her room, so it seems that she looked for the guitar and found it. And that's why everyone got kicked out. She got found. Even after all this, Susie didn't manage to read the code. Upon approaching the church in the rain, Susie asks Chris why Noelle was acting so weird, and why she couldn't talk to Chris in front of Susie. She then asks what they were talking about. At this point, the game locks up. The entire town freezes. The rain sounds stop. The music stops. A pink hue washes over the screen. A dialogue window appears in the same way it does when we're choosing what Chris says. This time, however, there aren't any options. We can move the soul, but nothing we do affects anything. This could be Chris using all of their might to prevent us from making them say what really happened. They really do not want Susie to know, so they're trying their hardest to keep things on track. It seems like Chris does say something, however, as Susie says what in her next piece of text. It seems that maybe Chris took this opportunity to say something to Susie, but it's not entirely clear. From this point, the Dark World continues as it usually would, until we get the choice to think about Susie. If we refuse, we can choose to think about Noelle instead. Upon doing this, we start to see a tiny red dot form in the middle of the screen. We then hear Noelle's voice saying thank you. After this, the screen flashes red and Chris is seen collapsed on the floor. Susie says they were breathing heavily. Another moment here of Chris just being overwhelmed and stressed about what is happening right now. Similarly to the cracking sprite, this red dot could represent the control that we have exerted over Noelle maybe. It seems that Noelle might be thankful for what we did. At least it seems she is now in her probably slightly brainwashed state. This could show her becoming more subservient to our control. A very interesting alternate interpretation of this moment is that we sort of split our soul between Chris and Noelle, either literally splitting the soul or dividing our control between both of them. Evidenced by the fact that we can actually move the red dot when it appears in that previous scene. Perhaps we've now exerted so much control over Noelle that she actually has some of the player's soul within her. That's what this red cracking sprite could represent. It is the same red as the soul after all. In this moment, Susie asks Chris a question about them and Noelle. So I think when the screen goes pink, we're choosing dialogue options based on Noelle's mind, as it was a question posed to both of them. If you imagine that the dialogue options we get in regular scenes are choices between all the possible options a person comes up with in their mind when they're posed a question, even if it's not necessarily how they would actually answer, then it would make sense that, in this moment, Noelle would have no thoughts in her mind that pertain to this question, as she didn't actually hear it. This results in an entirely blank text box. We can't answer anything for Noelle as she isn't actually in this scene, but we as the player still have control over her. Next, in the tea party scene with Gerson, he figures out that Chris is probably going through something quite hard right now, and they figure that Chris is just going through the motions day to day. Maybe this implies that Chris is just trying to see the story to the end now, as quick as possible, just to get it over and done with. At any opportunity they can, are trying to put the story back on a more favourable path for them. As soon as we're out of their body, the better. Then they can maybe try and salvage some of this. Gerson then talks about trying to find small good things out of a bad situation, which I guess is what we've observed Chris doing thus far. Chris is offered an apple, which they eat the entirety of, including the core. We know that Chris is linked to the concept concept of apples. They have apple shampoo. The fact that Chris eats the entire apple here is very unnerving. It's almost as if they're thinking that they aren't even worth being here anymore. Maybe they're thinking they're better off dead at this point to try and save everyone else. There's also the whole concept of like the original sin of Eve in the Garden of Eden eating an apple, which then causes evil to come into the world. Could there have been some sort of similar original sin that Chris did in this world? Maybe when they summoned a demon years ago. Next, in the intermission in between the two dark worlds, checking the candles gives the option to pray for Noelle. Selecting this causes Chris to kick the candle stand in response. It seems they don't like even the mention of Noelle anymore, especially coming from the player. This moment is so raw from Chris. It's just showing how much bottled up anger they have that they can't express because we are in control of them. Then, when playing the piano with Susie, selecting the option "I'll never play again" causes Chris to stop themselves from saying it by biting their own hand. And Susie says that they really bit down. They really hate our guts at this point. Any control we're trying to place on them that they don't like, they will fight back on. They do not want us ruining another of their friendships. At the very end of the Dark World, after defeating the Titan, Valsei's speech changes. He wants to believe that there could be more than one ending to this story, but worries that any alternate endings may be even worse than the regular ending, which implies that the regular ending might be very bad anyway. This is seemingly massively alluding to the Snowgrave route being that much worse ending that we're on the path towards right now. This again sort of hints that Valsei has some inkling of what's going on right now, as he doesn't give this speech in the normal routes. Finally, we have an alternate ending to the chapter. It's fairly similar, apart from the fact that Chris doesn't put their phone on the ground this time. After shaking themselves in bed, trying to get to sleep, they get a phone call. It's Carol. I guess Chris doesn't answer the phone because she leaves a message here. She asks if Chris is going to the festival tomorrow, and she says that Noelle is really looking forward to seeing them. So it seems that whatever we did has made Noelle really fond of Chris all of a sudden. Perhaps it's the piece of our soul that's been put into Noelle, just our control over her in general that's doing that. This is likely very scary for Chris, because Chris does not want to be around Noelle, especially when we are in them, but it seems like now Noelle really wants to be near Chris. It's interesting to me again that on the normal route, in this scene we would get a call from the mysterious person over the phone who may or may not be the knight, and then in the weird route we get a phone call from Carol instead. Is that a parallel? Almost implying that Carol is the knight? Or it could be another red herring, who knows? We see that red dot yet again, and interestingly, the dot is much larger this time, almost as if our control over Noelle has grown over the course of the chapter. Then the credits roll. It makes me wonder if this piece of soul will eventually grow into a full soul or something. I still have a feeling that Chris's red soul is unique in some way in this world. That's why they need the soul to seal the fountains, and that's also why we are needed for the narrative to happen in the first place, because without us in the game, the soul wouldn't exist and wouldn't be able to seal the fountains. So I wonder if this is almost like growing a second soul to exert more control over people in this world. Finally, after all of this, Gaster still says well done to us at the end. So it seems he doesn't care one bit about how we treat the characters in this world. I wonder what that says about him. Maybe he's truly treating Deltarune's world as some sort of experiment, and the people within it as merely points of data, numbers, variables. We also have a bit of insight into why Chris would reinsert the soul even after a weird route. In the non-weird route, they get a call from someone. It's either the knight or it isn't. One of these calls tells Chris that they need the soul, so presumably without the soul, they wouldn't be able to seal the fountains. So I guess this means whoever is on the phone actually wants Chris to seal the fountains? I'm not saying it is, but if Carol is the knight, for example, then it might make sense that the only purpose of her opening the Dark Worlds is to look for deaths, so she wants them sealed after looking around inside. That's why she needs Chris to keep the soul in, as the soul is the only thing that can seal the fountains. Alternatively, if the knight is somehow manipulating Chris, as we sort of get a hint towards with the promise that they made, maybe sealing the fountains has something to do with the knight's overall plan. Maybe stealing them actually helps cause the roaring. This explains why, even after a Snowgrave route in chapter 2, Chris still reluctantly reinserts the soul, and same in chapter 3 and 4. It's required for the narrative to even happen in the first place. I'm very interested as to where this route might go now, because it seems it might greatly diverge from the main path. Toby Fox is doing psychological horror, and man, it's good. I mean, it's harrowing, and horrible, and terrible, and invasive, but it's good. It's well written, it's effective at making you feel the right emotions about these characters, despite it being your actions that have caused this. It did make me feel genuinely conflicted about going ahead with the route, because I genuinely cared about these characters. One of the interesting things about this is that Toby Fox has given us 3 save files in Deltarune, almost as if he wants us to have that little bit of detachment from the world, almost that he wants us to think, oh, it's okay, because in the other save file, I've recruited everyone, I've done everything the good way, I have a bit of leeway in another save file, in another universe, another timeline, with having the ability to effectively start and stop and abort and copy timelines to really treat the characters terribly. Overall, this might be one of the best horror experiences I've had, and it's not even from a proper horror game. I'm not even like a horror person, really. I've not really played that many horror games. The only ones I've really played are Five Nights at Freddy's, and I've only played a couple of those. But genuinely, I kind of love it when there are horror elements in non-horror games like this, and it really affected me deeply. I'm very cautiously intrigued as to where this route will go. If you want to help support me and the channel, I have a Ko-Fi that you can donate on, offer more longer lasting support. I have a Patreon, or you can become a member here on YouTube. Any of these things help support the channel, helps keep content coming, but don't worry if you can't. A like and subscribe on the video also helps greatly. All I want to say is thank you so much for watching. Thank you for watching all the Deltarune videos, it's been a blast, and I'll see you in whatever the next one is.